Dear students, this tutorial is going to be quite long since we're going to be talking about watercolor. I know that this is a technique that a lot of people like to learn in Painter since it gives nowadays a quite realistic aesthetic. And first to understand a little bit how this tool works, I'm going to show you the different types of watercolor that we have in Painter. So that we can put them all together, I'm going to just select the watercolors and put them in the list a little bit closer to each other. So the first one is the digital watercolor, the second one is the realistic watercolor, and the last one is just watercolor. So I'm just clicking and dragging it up in the list so that we have now the three different watercolors together. We're going to start with digital watercolor, which is the first one on the list. And the digital watercolor is the type of watercolor that actually works on a default layer. So I'm opening a normal default layer in Painter, and I'm going just to grab one brush. So I just have the simple new. This is a watercolor that you can see it has a little bit of the smeary potential from the brush, and if you do some more strength, it's going to be giving you a little bit more color. I'm going to get the first one, Fächerpinsel. So the Fächerpinsel is one that has this kind of corner around the brush, and you can see that it's not really working with a lot of color. You really have to have luck because it's not really giving me more or less color depending on the pressure I'm using, so it's a little bit random. If for us to understand the brush mechanics, I would say go up to the function Erweiterte Malwerkzeug-Einstellungen. Click on that. We are going to have this window open where we can change the single informations from this brush. And one thing that we can, for now as well, be changing, making it now or later makes no difference. So it's going to react on everything that you painted with this brush, is the chance to change this kind of frame around your trace. So we have here now on 0%. If I go very high, you're going to see that this line is going to be stronger and stronger, and we can do this anytime. So I can be working with this right now, I can change it, and it's going to be changing really the whole layer where this brush was used. And we can see that we are still working on the same kind of normal standard layer. The digital watercolor is a very controllable kind of brush. It renders very little, and you're going to have quite simple strokes coming out there, which are not going to give you so many surprises. So if you would like to have a lot of control, this is the digital watercolor, but I have to say that I don't really like the aesthetics of it. I really think this is not really very interesting. It does not really look like watercolor. It looks for me a little bit more like an acrylic brush. You have this kind of salt effect, which is quite interesting. Looks a little bit like stars. Gives you an interesting effect, but this is more or less it. Okay, so we're going to see other informations that is going to make you understand, for example, this very little amount of changeable variance for digital watercolor. We're going to jump into a more complex one so that you understand it a little bit better. And afterwards, this is going to be clear what it's meant. So I'm not going to be repeating all this information. I'm going to jump to something more complicated, which would be now the realistic watercolor. And this is actually the category I like the most when I'm talking about watercolor. We can see that at the moment I selected one brush on watercolor. Actually, I should make the first trace on the screen. We're going to see that at the moment I do that, I open automatically a new watercolor layer. So every single time you work with realistic watercolor or with the simple watercolor category, we're going to be working on a special watercolor layer. And this special watercolor layer is not compatible with Photoshop. So if you're jumping between Photoshop and Painter, or if you're saving your file as a Photoshop file, this layer at the end, when you save it as a PSD file, is going to be transformed into a standard layer so that when you open it back in Painter, it's not going to be working as a watercolor layer anymore. So for you to keep this kind of active, for you to be able to be changing and working on the same layer again as a watercolor layer, you have to save this file then as a RIF file. We're going to go back now to the brushes. I'm going to select it all and delete it. And we have in the realistic watercolor list a few very interesting brushes. And actually I could do just one whole tutorial about the realistic watercolor because there's so much to discover, and I really recommend you guys to be trying things out here. The first one that unfortunately in the new versions of Painter we just have one single variant of it is the fractal brush. And if you go to older versions of Painter, for the 2015 we used to have really a lot of them. I hope I'm right. So realistic watercolor here. Okay, so you used to have like a really good amount of this fractal variants that you can as well use from this list. So the good thing about this brush is that you're able to fill up a big area of paper with a watercolor technique, and it's not going to be stopping or blocking or having any troubles with your computer, since this is some kind of brush that even though it's rendering, it's not going to be too heavy for your computer. So you can see now that I just fill up a whole area. It's like a dry kind of brush. It has a nice kind of aesthetic. It has a nice depth. Okay, so I'm selecting it all by pressing Command A and delete. And I'm going to the next fractal version. So here you can see you have this kind of in German called körnig fractal, and in this case he's working with the paper texture as well, so that you can see now nicely the paper texture coming through. If I would select another paper texture, let me check what we have here. Italian watercolor. You would have this Italian watercolor coming through. So it's a quite nice technique, and like I said, you see a little bit of the paper texture, which is for a wet type of tool, not very common. So I'm going back to our new Painter 2019 version, and here we can see again for the realistic watercolor the list is a little bit smaller and they have much less from this fractal versions, but like I said, you can just jump to an earlier version and just collect brushes that you think are interesting and work on your illustration. I'm going to select Farbauftrag. I forgot the name of it in English. Well, I'm going to be using the German word for it. We have a few of these brushes, and I'm going to put them all together as well. So let me check. We have Farbauftrag Realistisch, we have Farbauftrag Rausch, and I thought we have more of it. Can be the Farbauftrag Trocken. Okay, we used to have 4. So we have the 4 of them now together. I just clicked and dragged it together. And we're going to see now this brush is, for me, one of the best brushes on watercolor. I'm not going to be showing all the brushes. I really hope you guys start kind of looking around a little bit. But this Farbauftrag geschmolzen, for example, at the moment I click on it, we're going to be working on a watercolor layer, and the window with all the commands starts getting a little bit larger. It's different from the digital watercolor. So I'm going to make one trace, and you're going to see how nice this brush is. It's a beautiful kind of watercolor effect, and gives you very, very interesting brush stroke. You have something that gets a little bit closer to the fractal, which is the one that I was showing you before, and this Farbauftrag realistisch really gets much closer from what we would have as a watercolor brush, at least the way I would be working watercolor on the paper. So if we check the realistisch watercolor palette that we have here, commands, we are going to be working with Farbauftrag. It means that we're going to be working with the texture that is going to come through is the texture from Farbauftrag instead of the texture from paper. We're going to Window, and we have here Farbauftrag, Bedienfelder, so down here. We're going to open this, and it actually looks a little bit like the paper window. You can see it's more or less the same. It just gives you a few options. It's less than the paper one. One that I like the most is the Wolke, is the first one. Painter just started putting a few extra versions of it in here, but to tell you the truth, I don't like any of them. This one I think is just to present. Keys is nice as well because it's not too strong as a variant, but the one I like and I think it's more realistic is actually the first one, the one called Wolken, in English clouds, and we're going to see that in this case we are working with the Farbauftrag called clouds, which is just here. So for us to be working with watercolor, one thing that we have to be aware is that we have two main options. We can just start painting and forget what's going on, and if you're really very fast, it's not much of a problem. But you can see that I'm painting and already this whole stuff is starting to render. So I have to be very, very quick, or I like to have the result from the paint which is not really fusing in each other. So we can see that the color is rendering, it's doing it quite fast. The computer is as well quite new. For the older computers it could take a little bit of time, and at the moment it stopped rendering and I start painting something on top of it. We're going to have a very strong kind of separation from the colors. So this is one way to, if you have a good new computer, to be working. But what I would really recommend you guys is to be working with the stop diffusion, so that you start clicking on it. It's kind of a pause button, and now we can start illustrating. You can go a little bit inside, mix a little bit. The more color you bring into it, like if I do a very short or a very soft trace, it's going to be a very little color that comes through. If I do a very strong trace and I paint, it's going to have more heaviness. There is much more paint coming through as well, and it's going to take in consideration this when it starts rendering. So let me say I finished it and I'm going to start rendering. The whole color is going to be getting inside of each other, and you're not going to have a very strong line or a very strong separation. So that you can see, I put on one side the red while it was paused and rendered afterwards. And if I would have waited to render and then do the line, you're going to see this is what I get. I get a stronger division between the colors. Okay, so depending on what you want, it's more interesting to put all the colors together first and then render. It's better for your computer if it's not very fast or very strong, but it really depends on what you would like to have as a result. We're going to check a few more brushes in here, and afterwards we're moving to the other category. But here we can see as well a few informations which are important if you're working with watercolor. We have to say that at the moment you're working on paper, you kind of pay attention on all this information, but it's more intuitive. And here you really have to stop and think like, what do I really need? I need more water, I need more pigment, I need the paper to be wet, I need some air to blow. In which direction? Should it blow very strongly? Should it blow very softly? Should my paper absorb a lot of color, or should it absorb as little color, as little pigment as possible? So these are things that you should really be considering and thinking about when you're working with digital watercolor, and you have actually it all around here. So if you have a lot of wetness, you're going to have, for example, less color concentration. You can make the color runs more or run less. If you would like to have the color really to be darker, for example, if I grab like a very dark red, I can go down on weight, and if I do like a kind of line around here, you're going to see that this line is very soft. And if I go higher on weight and I do a trace, you see that the color gets much closer to the color that you have on the color wheel. So if you really want to be working realistically based on the color that you select, I would really go up on this pigment weight information, and you have the possibility as well to be working with wind, so that the whole color starts kind of flowing down on the paper. So for the moment the wind strength is on 0%. If I do it very, very high, I have a very wet tool. Viscosity is very low, and I'm going to do another trace around here. I just hope it's flowing on the right direction. So now you can see as well the difference between one and the other one, combined as well with the Farbauftrag, so that you're going to have this texture, this cloudy texture from the Farbauftrag on this brush. And it's going to be flowing because we just increased the strength of the wind, and we increased the amount of wetness is on 100%, the viscosity, which makes the paint gets very less fluid, it gets stickier on the paper, is quite low. We have a quite big, or 100% Fließwiderstand. Actually, it makes no sense to have it high. Let me see what happens when I have it very low. So that in this case you have here more texture, it really gets hold on the paper structure, and here it does not get hold on the paper structure, but it floats more or less the same amount. You really have to be trying things out to see what happens. One other thing that I would like to be showing is this kind of watercolor eraser. It's quite interesting because it keeps the kind of watercolor style or look, because if I would go to a normal eraser and I would start erasing here, you can see that it's going to be very sharp, it's going to be very digital, and at least the watercolor eraser is going to be working kind of a little bit faithfuler to the watercolor aesthetic. So you have a lot of different options in realistic watercolor. Try a few things out. There's another watercolor, the simple watercolor, and it works as well based on the watercolor layer. So if you check this out, you're going to have as well one thing that I like for example the salty eraser, and it gives you like a cells texture depending on what you would like to be working or what you would like to do. It's quite interesting. You can see that the control from this brush is a little bit smaller than the one you would have on the realistic watercolor. And you have a lot of different erasers going on here, which is interesting as well, since you can use this on the watercolor layer that we can use for the realistic watercolor. Wait, it's not going to be painting. You can see, wow, what's going on here. So this is Sprenkel verlaufend, and it's quite interesting to see that he's picking the black and he's picking a little bit of the red, and he's still rendering, and he is running a lot. And this is something that's, you have absolutely no real control on this brush. Okay, so I'm just changing the main color, so you can see I went to the turquoise, but it's a very dark turquoise, and it's kind of blowing the black out of the turquoise color. It's a good fun, but actually, unless you really like to be working with something that you have no control at all, would not really personally be able to be working with this unless I would just let it go and just react to whatever comes out. Okay, so normal watercolor, I would say it's good because of the erasers that you have in here. And I would recommend you guys to be working with a realistic watercolor. On the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys one example how you can effectively work with these tools apart from the brush mechanics of it. Talk to you soon.